can you see my screen? Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here. The paper is, we have prepared the paper, Anna and myself, but I will be the only one speaking, although she will join us for the questions. And I want to start thanking David and Stefan for this kind invitation. I'm really honored. Being invited to a keynote speaker means that you're getting old. So I have to assume that, but it's a very nice side of that. And it's very important to be precisely in this conference because although I have never been part of it, I have written down in my diary every single meeting, and at the end I couldn't attend. So this time I'm attending, although from Madrid. Okay, let's start. In a seminal article published in 1992, Don Randall presented the principles of what he ironically called the Musicological Toolbox, the research tools and conventions in our field that ensure familiarity and consistency, and keep the purity of the discipline to avoid any deviation from the academic canon. Like a computer's interface, the primary function of the Musicological Toolbox is, and I quote, to help reduce the time and effort required to produce the scholarly product, end of quote, as well as to preserve the inherited rules, the look and feel, and the focus of our academic production. In the same volume, Robert Morgan observed that the history of Western music theory and analysis is deeply rooted in the conviction that, and I quote, music constitutes a well-formed and coherent language, that there is a right way of understanding and realizing musical relationships, and correspondingly a wrong way as well. End of quote. Underlying music theory is the belief in an unchanging eternal order surpassing time-bound stylistic transformations, a conviction that is essentially at odds with any historical perspective of music. The rise of different approaches to the study of music, be them ethnomusicology, critical musicology, or computational musicology, was more the result of a change in methodology than a change in the object of inquiry. In other words, it was a switch of the toolbox, a transformation of the look and feel. The maturity of any branch of knowledge is confirmed precisely by the establishment of its own toolbox, involving its own societies, conferences, journals, jargons, degrees, prejudices, and of course, jobs. To a great extent, disciplines are a matter of power, a means to administrate the limited resources available in academia, as already observed by Bourdieu. Despite this critical perspective, it is fair to acknowledge that new methodologies normally result in the enrichment of knowledge, and this should be our main goal as academics. But it is also true that when working in isolation within the scope of our restricted academic environment, the fruit of our investigation has obvious limits. The rise of interdisciplinarity in the late 20th century derived from the awareness of the constraints of isolated knowledge. If separate disciplines need to join forces to grow, this is even truer within the disciplines themselves, the branches of which, at least in theory, investigate the same subject. A good and positive example in our field has been the interaction between historical musicology and ethnomusicology. The rise of the cultural history of music in the last few decades was a consequence of the adoption of the methods of ethnomusicology to study the music of the past. Quoting Randall again, musicology and ethnomusicology begin to look a great deal more alike when we recognize that there is no such a thing as a work without a context. One of the reasons for the relative isolation of the various branches of musicology is that, to a great extent, music research has been and still is an individual enterprise. Most articles and monographs, even most conference papers, are commonly signed by a single author, or two at the most. This is certainly a consequence of the discipline's tradition, the musicological toolbox, but also derived from the methods of evaluation of academic careers. In Anglo-American universities, career promotion is always dependent on the individual publication of journal articles and at least one monograph. In Spain, very often the evaluation of publications signed by two or more authors is rated below individual contributions. In other words, collaboration is penalized. A collateral consequence of such individual research is that each publication is normally confined to the specific branch of its author's expertise. I am primarily a historical musicologist, and most of my publications essentially belong to that field. It is true that I usually apply methodologies from other disciplines and branches in individual publications, such as philology, history, music analysis, or ethnomusicology. Yet my own specialty usually prevails, and it is not unlikely that scholars from those other fields might find my using of their methods somehow naive, if not entirely flawed. As we all know, this is not the case in other academic disciplines, particularly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where the rule is to acknowledge the contribution of several authors, usually not fewer than 3 and very often more than a dozen. Obviously, this is a consequence of different academic conventions and mostly derived from the predominance of teamwork in STEM research. For example, the recommendations for conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals state that the authorship of scientific papers should be based on 4 criteria. First, substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. Second, drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. Third, final approval of the version to be published. And fourth, agreement to be accountable for all the aspects of the work in ensuring that the questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. If we were to apply these criteria to musicology, publications deriving from a master's and doctoral thesis should include the signature of the supervisor, as it happens in many fields. However, no academic musicologist would dare to do so under the risk of being accused of appropriation of their students' work. Also, if we were to apply medical conventions, the work of music engravers, data collectors, database compilers, and research assistants should also be recognized in some way. Yet in our field, all these contributions are usually accommodated in the acknowledgement page only, if at all. Beyond traditions, conventions, and concepts of authorship, the prevalence of individual isolated research in certain disciplines is also an aftermath of funding schemes. In STEM fields, research structures and funding resources favor collaboration, as scholars usually work in teams associated to laboratories, where every member is paid to contribute their knowledge to the common goal. This working structure is thus reflected in their academic output. This is rarely the case in the humanities, where collaboration, when it exists, is more the result of individual eagerness and enthusiasm than of the existence of any professional structure. To put it bluntly, scholars in the humanities collaborate during their spare time, after having completed all their compulsory duties. Major funding schemes, such as the European Research Council grants, are fostering a dramatic shift in the research procedures and structures of many disciplines. Almost for the first time in history, musicologists and other scholars are having the opportunity to build research teams in which most members receive their salaries to work exclusively on the given project. They are paid not to teach, nor to study a degree, or to carry on their own research interests, but to contribute the best of their time and energy to the main goal defined in the project. In some way, thanks to these large schemes, musicology is starting to move from the individual desk to the lab, from the Lone Ranger to the squad, from the prima donna to the choir, from the ivory tower to the interaction of specialists of several branches and disciplines. The possibility of building a musicology lab has one fundamental benefit. It allows you to think differently, in new magnitude orders. It allows you to imagine how to apply methodologies and techniques that are beyond the capacity of the individual scholar. In short, building a musicology lab ultimately represents a change of paradigm, a new toolbox, a window of opportunity to expand your methodologies and, more important, to implement true interdisciplinarity. Yet, it also has consequences that can hardly be truly evaluated when you write your application to the scheme. Teamwork requires defining procedures and protocols for both research and publications. to ascribe tasks to every team member, to establish milestones, to coordinate and supervise achievements, to confront problems. Team members need to realize that although they have been chosen because of their skills and compromise, they have become part of a group with a common target, which sometimes requires them to leave aside their individual personal goals and interests to join forces with the working community. And in individual disciplines such as musicology, this confronts the Devo character that we researchers tend to have. I do not think we have yet properly assessed the implications of these shifts for our discipline. In my case, I have been principal investigator of the Didone project, funded by an advance grant by the European Research Council for over 2 years. And only now I'm starting to grasp how teamwork is changing my own procedures, as well as those of my colleagues, and how my early decisions failed because I was not aware of the change of paradigm required. This is the experience I would like to share with you today. Applying to a funding scheme of the magnitude of the ERC advance grants is like writing a letter to Santa Claus. You are invited to imagine, to request everything you have been longing for, to assemble a true dream team to work with you. In academia, this starts with the declaration of the primary research question. In my case, everything began with a question that had been in the back of my mind since I started to study music some 40 years ago. How are emotions expressed through music? Please note that the question does not refer to the psychological dimension of music, the aesthetic level. How might music move emotions in us? But to the poetic and neutral levels. What I was looking for is to understand the resources used by composers to create works aiming to be expressive of specific emotions. Whether these compositions eventually arise those emotions in the listener would be a completely separate matter. In other words, I wanted and still want to know what makes music so powerful, and I quote, to affect the minds of all, to get inscribed in the soul of man, to be fixed in our memory in such a way that we do not have to think, and we are driven like waking up from a dream, in the words of the medieval theorist Gladian. I am aware that this question does not sound very original, as emotions have become one of the hot topics of our time. From politics to entertainment, from advertising to music, from television to computer science, we have suddenly discovered the importance of emotions in our lives, how emotions shape and drive essential decisions, how the gurus pulling the strings of modern society influence our behavior to buy certain goods, vote for specific candidates, or plan our holidays by moving the emotions of our souls. The novelty of the Didone project lies not so much in its research question itself, but in the materials used and the methodology chosen to find answers to that question, as I shall explain soon. Indeed, the connection between music and emotion has become an important academic topic in the last 2 decades, with hundreds of publications on it. However, this relationship is as old as musical thought itself. As you all know, the belief in the capacity of music to move human emotions can be traced back to ancient Greece. The same conviction, based on the research of the Italian erudite Girolamo May, whose name, by the way, does not seem to be related to the Music Encoding Initiative, MEI, was the trigger that moved the members of the Florentine Cameratas to invent, in the late 16th century, the form of drama with music that we now call opera. A few years later, the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes, opened his first treatise, written in 1618, with the following statement: the aim of music is to delight and to move various emotions in us. He was neither the first nor the last. Today, there is a scholarly consensus that emotions play a central role in Western music, and particularly in Italian opera. As expressed by the musicologist Karl Dahlhaus, if we regard the affects, the emotions, and the emotional conflicts expressed musically on stage in the form of arias, duets, and ensembles as the true musical drama, dramaturgical analysis of an opera should not start with the way a narratable action is reflected in music. Rather, quite the reverse, it should try to show how an action constituted as a drama of affects, primarily by musical means, comes to be based on a storyline in order to take shape on stage. The question at this point emerges. If emotions are one of the main features of the most distinctive musical unit in opera, the arias, if emotions are the true musical drama, should not we be able to study them, to analyze them, to categorize them, and to tabulate them in a systematic manner, as we can do with key, harmony, musical form, verse structure, and so many apparently objective elements in musical construction? How can we discuss the meaning and function of the operatic aria? How can we discuss musical drama at all without taking into account its emotional semantics? Indeed, understanding emotions expressed in the aria should be a precondition to study opera. This is precisely the point of departure of the Didone project, to study how emotions are expressed in opera. Walking this path requires several steps that are listed in the slide in front of you, and because I'm going to go through every one of them, I'm not going to read them aloud. The first step is to select a corpus of music expressive of emotions. One of the main novelties of the Didone project is that we do not depart from any existing musical corpus, either in audio recording or in symbolic notation. On the contrary, we have identified a historical body of music that we believe to be expressive of emotions, a collection that is only available in manuscripts disseminated in dozens of libraries and archives around the world, Metastasian opera seria. Our point of departure is the well-established assumption, in the words of John Walter Hill that you can read, that in 18th century Italian opera, arias were thought capable of suggesting one or two emotions chosen from a wide range of subtly varied passions. Opera structure and aria form were relatively stable during most of the 18th century. Operas consisted of an alternation of recitatives and arias, while choruses, duets, and ensembles were seldom used. The action takes place during the recitatives, while arias are close, self-contained, and independent musical units that suspend the dramatic time to express, in the form of a monologue, the emotions experimented by the character on stage. Most aria poems have two stanzas, each one set to different music, and the first part usually repeated after the second, either in the da capo or dal segno form, or, as the century progressed, in other ternary schemata. In short, most arias have a tripartite form where the third section is a repetition or variant of the first one. The consistency of form and function of operatic arias during this period makes it possible to compare them in order to identify coincidences and differences, and eventually to trace features that may be related to the expression of emotions. There is another important singularity that makes opera seria particularly suitable for our goal. The leading librettist in the period was Pietro Metastasio, whose 26 librettos were set to music nearly 1,000 times by more than 300 composers throughout more than a century. Metastasio's influence was so overwhelming that during the 1750s, settings of his librettos present over 30% of all the operas performed in Europe. Many of his drami per musica were set to music over 50 times, and one of them, Artaserse, nearly reached more than 100 musical settings. In the Didone project, we have chosen his five most popular librettos, for which 30 or more versions survive. Didone Abbandonata, Alessandro nell'Indie, Artaserse, Adriano in Syria, and Demofonte. It is true that most librettos underwent changes in each production, changes that imply the suppression of some arias and the replacement of others. In most later versions, only a handful of arias from the original libretto survive, while there are dozens of substitute arias that would need a case-by-case investigation. Even considering these circumstances, our research confirmed that dozens of settings of a high number of arias from the same Metastasian librettos still survive in manuscript form. The advantage of this corpus is that we can easily compare the musical settings of different composers for the same aria poems, written for the same character at the same point in the plot, and thus purportedly expressing the same emotion. I will illustrate this in a minute with a couple of examples. The second phase is to define a conceptual and taxonomical framework for human emotions. One of the major challenges of this project is to adopt this framework. Our point of departure was the absence of any consensus academic consensus, even within the realms of psychology, physiology, or neuroscience, on the very concept of emotion or on its categories, dynamics, and signification. The psychologist Robert Plutchik writes that almost everyone agrees that the study of emotion is one of the most confused and still open chapters in the history of psychology. The obvious reason is that emotions are not clear and distinct objects that can be identified, measured, described, and compared. Emotions cannot even be observed. We know their existence indirectly through their reflection on the body, heart pulse, face color, breath, muscular tension, face gesture, or neural stimulation, through individual behavior or through verbal description. Any attempt to describe emotions is biased by their subjective character and by the absence of a shared and accepted scientific language. For this reason, and after a thorough revision of historical and modern theories of human emotions, we decided to apply a conjugate theory of human emotions. This is to say, a theory, and I'm quoting John Walter Hill again, which shares its fundamental basis, assumptions, and vocabulary with the theory of the period, but which answers the modern requirements for degrees of thoroughness, consistency, and precision that are generally not found in the theory of the period when viewed from a modern perspective. In other words, we have adopted the taxonomy and conceptual framework familiar to the 18th century individuals involved in opera production. In an article currently in press, written together with Jose Maria Dominguez, a senior member of the Didone team, we explained that and justified the application of our analysis of the theory of human emotions defined by René Descartes in Les Passions de l'âme. This treatise is the first systematic attempt to explain the physiological dynamics of human emotions from a scientific point of view, as well as the most comprehensive and organized classification of human passions in that period. More importantly, The Passions of the Soul was the reference work on this matter during the 18th century, including contemporary music theorists such as Johannes Mattheson, and the conceptualization applied by Metastasio in the creation of his dramas. Descartes' taxonomy identifies 6 basic passions and 43 further passions that either derive from this or are a combination of the basic ones. Descartes also identifies other features of each emotion, such as the basic passion from which it derives, its positive, negative, or neutral valence, and its temporary reference, past, present, or future. And here, what you're seeing is a visual presentation of the whole system of passions by Descartes that is included in the article that is going to come out soon. The third step is to define a methodology to classify music works by the emotion expressed. But the Didone practice is not about philosophy, but about music. And identifying the emotion expressed by a piece of music is even more subjective than the task of interpreting Descartes' theory. Most experiments to classify music emotionally are based on the opinion expressed by a group of listeners. This is a standard procedure in psychology and can attain notable results regarding how emotions are perceived by listeners, but has 2 major drawbacks for our project. First, as I explained earlier, the aim of the Didone project is not to explore the emotion perceived, but the emotion expressed in a work of music. And second, the emotional perception of a modern listener, with or without musical training, can hardly be equated to that of an 18th century one, because their personal and musical background and experiences are radically diverse. For this reason, we need to pursue a different path. The advantage of operatic arias is that they are not abstract pieces of music, as it happens with instrumental works, but do have a poetic text sung by a well-defined character whose personal circumstances are clearly explained in the poetic text and occur within specific points in the development of the plot. All elements of the drama, from the characters to the action and the words they use, are like a magical torch that illuminates the emotional semantics of each area. In this context, our methodology to label emotions of each area basically consists in the careful reading of the librettos under the light of Descartes' taxonomy, in order to identify one or several passions that are suggested by the poet in a specific point of the plot. To reach this goal, we need to examine 6 main features. First, the constellation of characters and their specific circumstances, age, gender, social status, and dramatic function. Second, the relationship between characters, particularly kinship and emotional ties. Third, the implications of eventual concealment of identity of one or more characters. Fourth, the succession of actions in the plot that provoke changes in the emotional status of one or more characters. 5, the addressee of the aria. And 6, the actual words of both each aria poem and the recitative preceding it. The combined analysis of these 6 features for each of the arias in the librettos allows their systematic classification. Each of them receives several labels: the emotion or emotions expressed, the valence, positive, negative, or neutral, the basic passion associated, and the temporary reference, past, present, or future. Limiting our scope to just 5 librettos by Metastasio makes the process much simpler than it would look like, as they have in total 182 original arias that have been classified according to the procedure just explained. In those librettos, we have identified a total of 25 different emotions out of the 49 categories from the Descartes taxonomy. For a detailed discussion of the application to the system to each of these librettos we are studying, I invite you to watch the seminars delivered by Jose Maria Dominguez and myself and available in the Didone Project webpage. Here, I would like to illustrate the process with just 2 examples. At the beginning of the opera, Didone Abbandonata, Iarba, king of the Moors, disguised as his own ambassador, visits Didone, the queen of Carthago, in her own palace. There, he claims that she must marry him, or otherwise she would become his enemy and would be destroyed. Didone's reply in the aria, Son Regina e sono amante, is a straightforward proto-feminist statement, declaring herself to be a queen and a lover, and that no one will rule her throne or her bed. We could spend hours discussing the nuances of the emotions expressed in this aria, yet most of you would agree that it is a statement of pride, as Didone expressed her female autonomy from male control, as well as boldness, since she is bravely confronting her eventual male antagonist and slayer. The other example comes from the opera de Mofonte, where Timante, believed to be the son of the ruling king, is secretly married to Dircea, thought to be the daughter of the prime minister Matuccio, and both have a child called Olinto, baby boy, a toddler more. At the beginning of the third act, Timante finds out that Dircea is in truth the Mofonte's daughter, implying that he has unconsciously committed the most terrible of all sins, incest, as he has married his own sister and is the father of his own nephew. After a moment of despair, Dircea, who is unaware of the information, brings the little boy in front of the father, thus inspiring the aria Misero Pargoletto, sung by Timante to his son. The confrontation with his abhorrent crime is portrayed in the aria, expressive of both terror for the horrible consequences of his acts, as well as pity towards a boy that is the fruit of unconscious evil. As illustrated by these 2 examples, our emotional labeling process is built on a careful analysis of the libretto, which takes into account all the factors involved in the drama. The next step is a practical procedure to compile data. This step requires more workload in our project. The step that requires more workload in our project consists in the compilation of social historical data and the creation of the corpus. Most team members participate in this task, as many devote all their time to it. They include our 4 musical engravers working full-time, Carlota González, Alberto Cubero, Iván González, and David Almazán, 3 part-time practical musicians involved in the correction of copies, Javier Ulises Illán, José Antonio Montaño and Teresa Casanova, 1 research assistant, Gorka Rubiales, and 3 researchers, the musicologist Tatiana Araez, the librettologist Valentina Anzani, and the technical supervisor and co-author of this keynote, Ana Llorens, who organizes and supervises the whole procedure. Most of these team members have both music and musicology degrees, including several instrumentalists and 3 conductors specialized in early music. The process involves several phases. The first phase consists in the compilation of a complete inventory of the sources of all musical settings of each libretto. This is not the place to explain all the requirements to locate, identify, and retrieve the poetic and musical sources of some 180 operas. Despite the substantial information available in reference works such as New Grove, Sartori, Rhythm or Corago, members of the Didone team have found many other sources not identified here, as illustrated by the detailed catalog of the sources of Demofonte recently published by Llorens, Rubiales, and Ursula. The next step is the provision of digital copies of the sources identified as most relevant to our project. This task was initially undertaken in partnership with a number of European libraries, yet it was severely affected by the COVID-19 lockdown. To overcome this difficulty, two of our researchers, Anzani and Araez, are currently visiting the libraries in person and making digital photographs of the musical manuscripts and poetic imprints. The process of engraving and producing encoded versions of the arias faces all the challenges of making music editions plus the additional demands of computational analysis. The first issue in our case was to define the editorial criteria that would work for a repertoire covering some 6 decades and written by dozens of composers who use different notational conventions. It soon became clear that for such a massive corpus, it was not practical to follow the conventions of critical editing. Our aim was not to reconstruct the ideal version of each aria, but to obtain a clean copy from the most reliable source, usually the one most surely connected with the premiere of the opera. However, some adjustments were required to grant consistency among our engraved arias, adjustments that deviate our copies from the conventions of critical editions. The purpose was to minimize false computational variants and to standardize the corpus. One important example is the notation of the voltas in the capo and Alceño arias, but the normalization of dynamics and articulations, and even the interpretation of time signatures to convey a sensible hypermetric structure. The Instituto de Ciencias Musicales, the research center at the Complutense that hosts the Didone project, has 3 years of experience in the publication of music editions of large scores. Since we have been using Finale since version number 1.0 30 years ago, we have taken the advantage of our team's expertise and decided to, from the beginning, to use that software. As you all know, Finale allows to automatically export the corpus as music XML files, but it's also important that our editions will be usable in the future for both digital and paper publications, as well as to extract parts from their eventually performance by orchestras and singers. During the early phases of this project, we explored the potential advantages of other encoding formats, particularly MEI and Hamdra. We had identified several differences and a few minor challenges to transfer between the diverse formats. Yet at the end, we were able to confirm that Music XML was the most satisfactory format for our needs. This is probably related to the fact that our corpus entirely corresponds to the common practice and has very few unconventional requirements, as would be the case with medieval or Renaissance music. Beyond the simple export from Finale, Music XML has 2 additional advantages. On the one hand, music files can be opened with common use music software such as MuseScore, which we use for our harmonic annotations, as I shall comment in a second. On the other, we can benefit from the power of the Music 21 library to extract meaningful information from our aria files in order to apply computational analysis. Our former team member, Paula Muñoz Lago, even contributed an improvement in version 6.5 of Music 21. As regards annotation, at the start of the period, we were not aware of any effective solution that can automatically extract harmonic information from encoded symbolic music. We tried some applications, but they were not reliable enough, especially in the junctures with double functionality or omitted roots in the chord. As we are convinced that harmony might be a major feature for music semantics, and specifically for the expression of emotions, we faced the necessity of finding or developing a system to annotate and analyze the harmonic construction of the arias. On this matter, we contacted members of the Digital and Cognitive Lab, Music Lab at the University of Lausanne, directed by Martin Rohrmeyer. They were already working on an annotation standard syntax for the extraction of harmonic including a library to extract harmonic annotations. Since music XML files are variable depending on the engraving software, they use MusicScore 3 to introduce and store the annotations to be extracted. My colleague Ana Llorens has been working with the DCML team for the last 18 months to improve the harmonic annotation standards that we are already applying to our corpus. Beyond the obvious benefits for our analysis, annotating by hand the harmony of several thousands of arias will result in a corpus of encoded music that could be used in the future for machine learning and the eventual development of more precise automatic system of harmonic annotation. The ultimate purpose of the Didone project is to identify musical features associated with the expression of emotions. To that aim, we aspire to design a model of analysis that can be applied to thousands of arias. The massive number of works to be analyzed necessarily exclude the inspection of individual details and puts the focus on parameters that can be compared on the large scale. Our music theorist, Ana Llorens, has defined 11 parameters on which to extract the data from the encoded corpus, either automatically or from the manual annotations. And you have the list in front of you. A number of specific metrics or features, currently around 200, have been musicologically defined for each of these parameters separately, with a view to combining them in the analysis. Some of the features, such as those referring to the key, the harmony, or the form, apply to the musical piece as a whole, and thus can be compared without further standardization. Others, such as those pertaining to the melodic construction and the textural density, however, depend on the number of parts or instruments sounding in the area, and even on the metric structure, the time signature of the piece, and the tempo. That is the reason why we have defined various hierarchical levels from which to extract the data, these being the score, the sound, and the part level. The metrics of the score level are extractable from all the areas in the corpus, whereas those on the sound and the part level vary depending on the scoring or instrumentation. Therefore, a number of metrics are extracted only from the part sounds that are present in the whole corpus, such as strings in the vocal part, whereas we aim at reflecting the influence of other instruments in other metrics that are extracted at the score level. At this stage, what we need is to extract, to develop the code to automatically extract data from the encoded musical corpus. We need to extract this data, and not just from the areas one by one, but also grouping thereof in order to be able to discern whether or not some historical or geographical factors, for instance, played a role in the way in which our corpus actually sounded, or in which we believe it to have sounded. Therefore, in Didone, we are developing two kinds of software. First of all, we are designing a library, Musif, through which we extract the desired metrics for each of the areas separately. Once the data are extracted, a large data frame of various thousands of rows and columns containing the data for each of the areas is being created, processed, and ultimately analyzed. The musical poetic metrics are placed alongside the passion or the passions expressed through the aria text, according to the method explained before, as well as other metadata that will help to interpret the data in a more historical and aesthetically informed manner. Secondly, we are creating code to generate data reports in the form of Excel spreadsheets with the select metrics at the area level, but also grouping the areas by a diversity of historical, geographical, dramatic, and even purely musical factors. This has two main advantages. First, these reports, along with the accompanying visualization, have been designed by our music theorist and are easily interpretable by her peers, thus fostering interdisciplinary collaboration. And second, they allow, thanks to human interpretation, the discrimination of stylistic, historical, or of other factors that may be playing a role in the ways in which composers spread specific text through music, beyond the influence of the emotion of the character on stage. The next step is the database. As you can imagine, to determine when and where the operas were premiered or who sang them for the first time, our team of historical musicologists have had to work on designing and building a large relational database where to store all the potential relevant data for our analytical enterprise and all the connections therein. While our guiding units is the opera production, with its venue, date, occasion, composers, singers, librettists, etc., in a process of specification, we descend to the area level, providing data on the singer's voice type and compass, key, time signature, source, variants, dramatic position, and passion. You have a visualization of the structure of the database in your screen. This approach is different from that of other databases such as Corago, which we took as our initial model. In this way, we can combine the musical and textual information extracted computationally from the music XML files with the contextual and historical data in which the information emerges. And the final step is the interpretative step. We're continually developing this phase at the IDONE project. The slide represents visualization prepared for several papers and publications of the IDONE team in the last couple of years. We are currently trying various statistical and machine learning methods to analyze the data. As a first step, our computer scientists, Daniel Ibáñez and Martín Serrano, and our senior statistician, Eduardo García Portugués, are doing some exploratory analysis, such as regression models, correspondence methods, decision trees, on data from a small portion of our corpus, some 500 areas. They are trying to determine whether there is a specific music metric, or most plausibly, a combination of some that can function as a good predictors for the positive versus negative valence of the emotions expressed in the areas. Yet it seems that this is too general a classification. Therefore, they have already started to focus on the 6 basic passions as defined by Descartes under musical expression, with some promising preliminary results. Whereas such an analysis treats the music historically, that is, our algorithm process the data regardless of their date or geographical provenance. Thanks to the data reported I mentioned before, Valentin Anzani and Nana Llorens have determined some traits specific to composers' vocal writing for the castrato Carestini in the 1740s in a paper recently given at the Tosca conference. And Ana Llorens and myself have observed some metrical and gender-related practices specific to the court Iberian productions in the mid-18th century that will come in an article very soon in Anuario Musical. And we are arriving to the conclusions. I hope it's not getting too long. I hope this little promenade has illustrated the aims and procedures of the IDONE project, and more importantly, the need for interdisciplinary work in the humanities. Choosing a complex cultural product as the main object of our investigation automatically implies going beyond music. It requires understanding the poetic language, the dramaturgy, the social and political context, the contemporary codes and values, the production system, the technical resources, and the philosophical background of opera. In other words, we depart from a series of decisions grounded on historical evidence and influenced by cultural and philosophical concerns to search for answers through the application of music analysis, statistics, and algorithms to an encoded corpus of music. The process has implied transforming our musicological toolbox. If the comprehensive study of opera necessarily calls for interdisciplinarity, massive analysis of operatic areas requires going one step further within the discipline of music itself, in an agreement between different branches of musical research. This could appear to be a simple task, but has certainly required a substantial dose of patience, compromise, and empathy to understand and apply the procedures and requirements of colleagues from other branches. The best example is our system to engrave areas. We call it the Areas Factory because it runs like an industrial process involving most of the team. It is a process in which each member must perform specific tasks and register them using the app Trello in order to produce top quality encoded versions. We have already learned a great deal in the course: how to work together, how to fulfill our individual tasks, how the final results depend on the contribution of every member, how to leave aside our personal inclination and needs to reach agreements and find solutions to each challenge. In short, we have started to define what we could call a musicology lab. I am using the plural because this procedure was not imposed upside down. Quite the opposite, it has been the result of the input of all members, and their invaluable contribution have helped to define and polish measures and methods. The transformation has taken place inside the group, and we still need to expand its influence beyond our research environment. We need to demonstrate that 3 or more authors signing an article do not divide its value. Quite the opposite, their contributions can multiply the quality of the work. We need to show how the work of a team, also in music research, can reach scientific summits that are unattainable to individual scholars. We also need to encourage financial support for new professional profiles in musicology beyond the traditional teacher research. In short, we need to keep transforming the musicological toolbox. As explained earlier, the main outcome of the Didone project will be to identify certain resources used by 18th century operatic composers to express emotions. Beyond this, we foresee a number of collateral outputs that will hopefully benefit a wide musicological community. One significant result will be the development of algorithms for corpus analysis of symbolic music that will be applicable to other corpora. Furthermore, a major fruit will be to make accessible new editions of thousands of neglected areas in PDF format that will expand the music available to both individual performers and operatic venues. These areas will also be distributed in Music XML and annotated music score formats to allow other scholars to double test our analytical processes, as well as to apply other methodologies to our corpus. We have already set a date to grant open access to this massive corpus. It will take place on 1st of February 2024, exactly 3 centuries after the first Drama per Musica by Pietro Metastasio, Didone Abbandonata, was premiered in Naples with music by Leonardo Vinci. This will be our humble tribute to one of the most important figures in the history of opera. Writing this paper has also been a transformative process in itself. I am very grateful to Stefan Munich and David Rizzo for their invitation to give a keynote on the most important conference on music technology, not only because of the honor of speaking to this illustrious audience, both physical and virtual, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because this paper has induced me to think in depth about the kind of work we are doing in the Didone project. If anyone deserves an applause today, they are the members of the Didone team, represented in this conference by 5 of us, a team that conforms a true musicology lab. I must thank you very much on their behalf for giving us this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Álvaro. Anna, for your paper, for your talk. It has been really, really interesting. Among the Descartes emotions catalog, I think most of us feel now emotions such as curiosity, wonder, joy. Congratulations for the team you built and for this holistic project. It's really amazing, I think. Now, those of you that have questions, please use the raise hand icon. Don't confuse with the clapping hands. Well, you can use clapping hands as many times as you want, but if you want to ask for a question, use the raise icon so that we can order the questions. And in any way, you can add them to the chat so we can ask the questions to Álvaro and to Anna. So now I'm stopping the recording, and let me. Okay.